All right, so where we left off from last week was setting up zones. Now we're getting into those policies, and we started playing that a little bit at the end of the lab day on Thursday. So security policies are kind of the fundamental of the whole Palo Alto firewall and how everything works. If in the old days you were using something like a Cisco router, you would have things like ACLs. You could have them up on switches. You guys probably configured a little bit of them in the Cisco classes. Policies work in a similar fashion, but are a little more flexible overall. So as traffic comes into a firewall, it's going to hit that upper left-hand corner and say, does this traffic match an existing session? Meaning, do we already have a session opened up for this traffic flow? If no, then we need to determine our source zone, the zone or DOS protection, any kind of forwarding lookup, destination zone, and then a security policy check. And at that point, if it all passes, we will assign it a session ID, at which point it goes back to the beginning. And now that it's a verified session, it will then go through app ID inspection or content ID inspection, determine whether or not that traffic is actually encrypted. If it is encrypted, do we have a policy to decrypt that traffic? If yes, then send it back through after we've decrypted it. If no on the other ones, then we go ahead and send it over to the security policy enforcement, which is where we determine whether or not we will drop it or accept it. And then we'll go ahead and forward that traffic on accordingly. So as those network packets are flowing across, we will either match and allow, or we will match and block. And the basic criteria is kind of set up to be that source zone and destination zone. You guys again saw a little bit of that last week on Thursday. And then for more granular criteria, we could say, do we want something like specific source address, destination address, port, application, URL categories, source users, and a HIP profile. We'll talk a little bit more about HIP profile in a little bit. Those are all fields that we can set in the policy rule. So basics, source and destination zone. Outside of that, we can really get as detailed as we want. So as the traffic comes in on the left-hand side from the client, we have our C2S flow, which we must enable using the rule. And then we have the S to C. Those are standing for server and client, in which case we can allow return traffic. And so a packet is matched to each session. Each session is matched to a security policy rule. A session can consist of one or two flows, a single flow like multicast traffic, or a two-flow example, something like TCP. A server definition for a firewall is different from a server definition for hosts. It is a traffic responder versus something that provides a service. Right? Anybody have any questions on that side of the house? Server differences? Okay. So to take a look at our security policies, we click on policies at the top, click on security on the left. And from there, we can manage the amount of columns and the information we're going to see. Typically, what you're looking for the most is going to be these tags that we can set up. And then you would filter out on this source zone, as well as this destination zone on this side as well. And again, you can set up all these other ones in between. This can be customized per user when they log in. So adjusting these columns, etc. You can get rid of them if you don't care. But the order in which all of these are listed, which is over here on this left-hand side, it starts at the top and works its way down until it matches traffic, right? And so these last two are essentially catch-all, meaning that if it's going between a zone, intra-zone, in the same zone, then we're going to just allow that traffic. If it is going between two zones and it doesn't match anything up above, we always kill that traffic in a deny policy. So those line numbers on the left, they never really move, only when the rule moves. So you can drag and drop those rules in different orders. You can also set them up to move up, move down, which you can see there with the move icon down here at the bottom. You can temporarily enable or disable policies if you're trying to do some testing. So for example, disabled ones are going to be like this row here where it's kind of grayed out, in which case it essentially skips it. So it'll be grayed out and in italics. That indicates that it is disabled. And then you can also right click on it and you can hit the log viewer and you can see the ones that match that particular case. All those buttons down there across the bottom are all things that you would use. So if we want to add a policy, a lot of times we will clone an existing policy. Like, for example, if we want to make a slight tweak, it makes sense to set up a clone policy, disable the original one, and in the clone, make the slight change. And if you test it, run it, and it doesn't brick something, then you can go ahead and delete the old policy out, or you could revert back to the old policy by simply deleting the new one you had and re-enabling the old one. Another good one is going to be this reset counter. We're going to show that here in a minute. But each policy will have a hit counter, and that hit counter will allow us to determine whether or not they're actually hitting our policy. If we have a policy that's not getting any hits, then we either have it too restrictive or whatever's coming through is never hitting the policy for that reason. So we would have to take a look. Another reason that may happen is you may have a policy higher up in the chain that is actually matching before the one that you wanted it to match down here. Remember, the first one that matches, that's the one that goes. So you want your more restrictive ones at the very top and your less restrictive ones towards the bottom. That kind of makes sense? All right. So again, intra-zone is going to be something that goes between the same zone. So it's in traffic or zone A going through to zone A, or zone B going to zone B. Interzone is going to be between the two zones, and then universal allows us to go both directions. So we can either go from zone A to zone A and zone B, or zone B to zone A and zone B. So 3 different rule types: intrazone, interzone, universal. Most of what you would set up would be probably universal. All right. When you want to set up those custom policies, you set that up over here on the side. By default, custom rules are always, the traffic is logged. So when you set those up, it's always logged. The predefined rules, which are only these 2 here at the bottom, those are set up to where traffic is not being logged. So when you are trying to troubleshoot and for whatever reason it's hitting one of those bottom 2, you may need to temporarily go in and override those and turn on logging so that you can see what's going on the inside. Otherwise, you wouldn't want that on for what reason? Anybody think of why we wouldn't want these bottom 2 defined rules to be logged? You got it. It would just fill the logs with lots and lots of data. Make it very, very hard to kind of filter through, sift through, and get it. You'd probably end up filling your log storage in a short amount of time. So what you're really caring about in most of that traffic is whether or not it hits one of the rules you created. You really only want to set up like maybe this intrazone. That one's already being allowed anyway. It's really this inner zone that you may want to inspect the most to try to figure out why in the world it's not matching one of your policies. All right. When you get a security rule match, those rules, again, are elevated from top to the bottom. So further rules are not evaluated once something matches. And so in this case, you have rule A, B, C, D. Could rule A and B be combined in this particular case? You guys take a look at this. So in this case, rule A says anything that's, it's an egress tag, type is universal. The source is from the inside going to the outside with an application of web browsing and a service of any. The second one is going from the guest network to the outside with web browsing and a service of any. Yeah, we should be able to, right? That matches kind of the universal side, where if it comes from the guest or inside going to the outside, because this application and service is matching everything through, then yes, we should be able to tweak that. Now, if you look at something like rule C, where we're going from DMZ to the outside, but they're only specifically allowing FTP and only the application default services, we would not want to combine that in, because now you're going to be more restrictive than what you were specifically asking for before. All right.
Could you just combine the tags then under the same rule?
Yeah, so these tags are just a way for you to clear and filter things out, is all that is. So those tags are otherwise meaningless, a way for you to filter things. That's it. What really matters is the fact that both of these are set for outside and this is set for inside guest. You could collapse these 2 down because everything over here is the same.
So if you were to replace the zones then, would you have both inside and guest on the same? Or would you,
yeah, so on the, you would become rule A, where it says inside and then guest would be a tag right below that. and then you would have outside going out. Yep. And you can have all your zones if you wanted to going out in that case. This is that hit counter I was talking about. So it's great for identifying rules that are frequently or seldom used or being used a lot. You can determine the first time and the last time a rule was actually used and view the number of applications seen by that rule. So for example, this one here we have set to applications of DNS, Google Base, Shutterfly, SSL, web browsing, and then our application default. We can see that we've had 386 hits going to this one. I suppose I should use the little thing here so for those online can see it. And we can see when the last hit was. If nothing is matching this within, like, say, the last year, we should try to figure out why that's no longer matching, right? Maybe another rule is catching it. Maybe it's no longer a valid rule. Maybe that server that's sitting over here, whatever this may be. In this case, it's not a specific address, right? It's just saying any traffic from Usersnet to the internet. If we're not seeing it a long period of time, something's changed. Now it's routing out something different. Something's going on. We can hit that reset. In order to reset that, we can also reset the hit counter for all rules or just the selected rule so that we can kind of figure out what's going on. If we see this number over here on the lower right for number of applications seen, what this allows us to do is we have any listed here. So we can start to see which applications are actually being used on that rule. And then we can refine our rule to definitely list the ones that we care about, right? So if we start seeing some random traffic show up there or we want to do it, when you guys first write rules, you want to write them the least restrictive, right? Then you want to kind of see what's going on in that particular rule for about 30 days. Then you can start redefining your rules and making them more restrictive so you can lock down the services. And we'll talk about those dates here and times in just a little bit. You can have things that would do a rule shadow, and sometimes you'll see this when you go to commit. You'll see this little rule shadow tab pop up here. And what that's saying is this is the rule, allow all traffic, actually shadows the rule of users to internet. So if we look at these two rules, you have number one, which is allow all traffic, because that's pretty much allowing anything from Usersnet to internet on any address, any service, any application. As soon as it hits that first one, it's gone through, right? It doesn't care. So this bottom rule, number two, where we're actually being more restrictive to only allow DNS, Google Base, Shutterfly, etc., that rule will never get hit. And so what that allows you to do is have the first one running, right? Get an idea of all the applications running, build this bottom rule so that we can actually put the applications that we care about in there. And then you can disable the first one and leave the second one enabled. Then we can test it. All right. But it's going to warn you that there's something overshadowing. As you build up rules over time and you get about 100 of these in there, you're going to find out that some are overshadowing because at one point you had it for this and you were really lenient, and then you have super restrictive ones down below that. And you just have to go through a policy cleanup procedure. And we'll talk about policy cleanup, which comes into the administration side. So when we want to add a rule, we go to policies, security, and add. There we can click on our general tab and we end up giving it some kind of name up here. From there, we select the rule type. This one has universal. What are the other two rule types? Pop quiz. Intrazone and interzone. By default, it was actually like right over here, right? Sometimes the instructors just give you the answer to see if you freak out. Universal is default. Remember that. That'll be on a quiz. Over here on tags, these are just optional tags that you can set to make it easier to identify when you guys are doing filtering. So if I want to set these all to red because it has to do with outside or whatever, that allows me to filter the entire display so that I only see those in there. So the more you tag things, the easier it is later down the road to filter things out. Let's see, you can group the rules by a tag if you choose to. And then this audit comment is pretty necessary. This allows you to describe when you made changes. It also has an archive here so we can go back and look through configuration logs. So as you guys make changes, make sure you update these comments as to why you did it, because you will do it. And then 2 months down the road, you will forget why you did what you did. Nobody documents anything. That's the real world. So try to document right here in the interface. Right? And I say this because I just got off a phone call this morning where I didn't document a rule, and now we're trying to figure out why I did what I did. Use the audit comment. All right. Up here at the top, you have the usage tab. This is only going to appear after you've actually created the rule and committed it. Otherwise, you will just get actions and everything over here to the left. Let's see. Rule changes archive. That's this little guy down here at the bottom. This is a way for us to see what's changed over time. This includes the configuration changes, rule changes, and also your comments that you had listed there. Right. Once you have that general tab set up, you can move on to the source tab. This is over here on the left where you have this source zone. This is where you can select multiple zones. So like, for example, that one we said earlier, you could select your user's net and your local net or whatever it was. And then on the destination, you could set the internet. You could specify a given IP, or you could even specify some dynamic lists. These dynamic lists would be something like bulletproof IPs or high-risk IPs. These are lists that are generated from Palo Alto, basically bad known IPs that are out there. They're constantly changing. This would be something that you would want to set up for like a block rule, for example. So if the source was the internet and the source addresses came from known malicious IPs, you would tell it to drop at your firewall. Now you're not even going to allow that block of IPs coming in. Right? They're known to be bad. Whether it's good traffic or bad traffic coming from those IPs, you're just going to ban them. Otherwise, you could set up regions, which would be blocks of IPs. You can actually set up physical regions. So if you want to block everything from the EU or block everything from Canada, you could set that up if you choose to do so. On the user side, you could set up where it is any or pre-login known users. This is a way for you guys to have them log in. We've talked about those user accounts, or specifically down to devices if you choose to do so. So left to right is more restrictive. So left is pretty open, meaning we just take the whole zone, all the devices, anything in it. As we work our way to the right, we're getting very specific down to what we're allowing and not allowing. Same way on the destination tag. Again, you could select, by default, it's set up there to any. You could select the destination zone, a bunch of destination addresses, and also your destination devices. All right. If you want to negate or AKA do the opposite of this rule, you could simply come down and click this checkbox, and that will end up matching all addresses that are not listed in this section. All right. So you may want to put a bunch of known IPs that you care about in here, and then you could hit negate and it'll take off everything but those IPs. Then your application, by default, this is where you're going to select actual applications, not port numbers. So this would be something like Adobe Connect Now Base or Google Base, and then you have to add Google Mail, Gmail, that kind of stuff. Any app that you're using on the internet, there's a very exhaustive list of all those apps inside of there. That is what we call app ID filtering. So we talked about that in the diagram of where it shows the flow. You could set up specific ones. You may also have ones over here on the right that say depends on. So if I choose Adobe Connect Now Base, that means I also have to have Flash, RTP, SSL, web browsing in order to do that one application. I have to have those filters turned on too. All right. The service, so go on to the service category to just straight up skip it. Oh, this is talking about the application. If you have missing dependencies when you try to commit, it's going to come back over here and say it requires Flash, RTP, etc. So if you did not get all of this set up on the right-hand side, which it should automatically fill in, if you were to remove one of those, it would come back and say, hey, I can't commit. I need those in order to have that available to me. All right. There again, you can hit this rule count. We can see exactly what's matching here on this rule and what dependencies going on when you try to do it. Service URL category. This is the service side is where you can think of like port numbers. All right. So this service of HTTP and service HTTPS, that's realistically just allowing what port for HTTP? Everybody knows what TCP port HTTP
80.
runs on, right? 80. Somebody said it over there. Good job. Anybody know if HTTPS? 443. All right. Sometimes you may need to set up other ones. There's not a whole lot of services built into the firewall, right? Because we want you to do app filtering, not necessarily service filtering where we're doing IP or port numbers. Does anybody know where we might want to set up a service as opposed to using an app? Can you think in a company where you might do that? If you're a custom programmer, you write your own code or you have a certain app running on a particular port. So say you're running a particular piece of software that runs on port 3001. It's not a known application. You guys wrote it. Therefore, you would have to allow port 3001 to go out. Does that kind of make sense? Now, if it's a known application, then use the application filtering. But if you literally wrote it, it's a Django website or it's some C-based program that you guys wrote, then you would add those in here into the service category. All right. For example, on your application side, this would be something like where you add Microsoft for your Xbox and able to go outbound, you would add the Microsoft application stuff in order to allow Xbox updates out or something like that behind the firewall update. Microsoft updates on your PC, all of those kind of things, you would have to go pick those applications to start allowing them, which is, again, why you would turn it to any at first, let your business run for 30 days, go back and figure out what your business is using. And you can also determine at what level they're using it. So maybe it was only access for Microsoft 3 times, which means maybe somebody had a Xbox on the network for that particular service, but Windows updates were accessed 739 times. Okay, well, we should probably allow the Microsoft updates. Maybe we don't need to allow the Xbox Connect system, right? On the right-hand side is a URL category. Again, this is a way for us to have URLs that we specifically want to filter out. So you can think of this like a text file with a bunch of known URLs that we're not going to allow. So you can see a bunch of different categories and topics over here, whether it's a list of auctions or any of the other ones listed there, we would go ahead and block those URLs on here. Now, we cannot add or remove from those lists. Those are predefined lists from Palo Alto, right? So you would, for example, if something is stuck in the adult section for whatever reason, but it's not really an adult website, you guys use it for business, but you want to block all the other adult website stuff, you would probably put the adult rule in. Then above that, you would create one specific that allows the website that you wanted to go ahead and authenticate, right? And over time, you probably have a list of those that violate this. You would want to put all of those into one rule above this rule and then have this as a catch-all at the bottom. That make sense? You can also create your own dynamic external list if you want to. So if you have other software, for example, Dan's Guardian or something like that running on your network that you're using for blacklisting those addresses, you can automatically inject those in here through an external dynamic list. All right. When creating a service, this is what we talked about before. So for example, if I have a very specific mail server that I'm running on an off port, I could go ahead and allow that through here by creating my own service, and I could use that new service inside this service URL category. A lot of times where I'll use this, again, is if we have our own system running something, or a Synology unit, for example, that's allowing certain file sharing on certain port numbers, we go ahead and manually set those port numbers that we're going to allow out because it doesn't show up as an application. The only predefined services are service HTTP and service HTTPS. All right. And then you get to the Actions tab. And so there we can choose to either allow, deny, drop, reset client, reset server, or reset client and server. All right. So allow and drop, you guys can pretty much understand that one, right? Or allow and deny, I should say. You either allow the traffic or you deny the traffic. When you deny the traffic, they know that you denied the traffic. All right. So if a user is trying to go out to a website, they're going to get an alert that you denied that traffic in some form or way. If you drop the traffic, that almost looks like the connection never even got there, right? We just get the packet in, we drop it. Well, on a TCP UDP or a TCP, that's just going to sit there and try to keep sending them until it responds, right? And it will never respond because the firewall just straight drops it. On a reset client, reset server, or both of those, we actually send a reset packet, and therefore they get some kind of communication back. So the idea behind a drop packet is if you guys have ever done like an Nmap scan and you're scanning ports, If it responds with something, then we know that that port is open and active, right? If we set up drop, the packet just dies. Therefore, scanners like that just think the port is done. It's not actually open, when in truth, it could be open on that side. Over here in the upper right-hand side, we have log settings. By default, everything is set to log the session at the end. What this means is it will not put it in the logs until that session has completely cleared the session table, which means if you guys are going to the logs and can't find anything, kind of like we were doing the other day, that's because it still had an open session. Until that session times out, nothing's going to show up in the logs. So if you guys are troubleshooting, you want to come in and optionally set this first one to log at session start, leave session in there as well. Then we will start getting logs right off the bat the moment a session is active. Remember, some of these sessions can be active for days, right? So you may never see anything set up in the logs. If that session is long and active, you won't see it till it ends up clearing. At the bottom, we can set up a schedule. This will allow us to set whenever this rule is active. So for example, you may have a rule in there that blocks all Facebook traffic or all destined traffic to a particular address. And then at 8 o'clock at night for an hour window, we open that up so that we can allow backups to go off site, right? Otherwise, we don't want to even allow that traffic, but during this hour window, we allow this to actually go out to a particular website. That's one use case of that. You could also set up QoS marking. Does anybody know what QoS is? Quality of service. That allows us to what? In theory. Prioritize traffic. Yep. So normally where we would use that is back in the days of VoIP. You always want to prioritize VoIP traffic to make it through the network first. Otherwise, we would drop packets and make phone calls really horrible. These days, QoS isn't used as much as it used to be back in the day, but still understanding because there's some networks you may still need to enable QoS. In that lower left-hand corner, you're going to see profile settings. We're going to get into that much deeper in the semester as to setting up those kind of profiles. But the schedules is a way for us to maybe have this particular rule active for a certain period of the day. So create a schedule with one or more start end times. You could set the enforcement dates and how you're going to set it up. It's great to block, maybe Facebook during the hours of 8 to 5 and afterwards you allow it, or something vice versa of that, right? Another one is maybe your file system server, you only allow access during your work hours of 8 to 5, right? If it's after 5, you kill access to your file system server. Yes, that doesn't allow your users to come in and work after hours, but that also means that if we take over your machine, we being, say, a hacker, then tries to do that stuff after hours, it's never going to allow that traffic through. They would have to do the attack during 8 to 5 when somebody's probably watching the network and actually do that, right? Most attackers try to do it in your off business hours because then you're not usually monitoring the system like you are when you're sitting there at work. All right, and then again, that usage tab at the top doesn't show up until after you've committed it, but it will tell you some basics like when that rule was created and when it was last edited. Down there in the activity, you can get when the last hit was, the first hit, kind of gives you an idea of where things are going to be happening. And then in the application scene up there, we can go ahead and start looking at those applications, making sure it matches what we expect. You do get the last 30 days of traffic there as well to kind of see how much traffic that rule has getting applied to it. Again, logging is turned off by default in the intra-zone, inner zone. If you want to change that, you click on the rule, click on the override button, and then you can come back in here and set your log session start if you're trying to do that for traffic and troubleshooting. Okay, down at the bottom, you have this option to highlight unused rules. This will be a way for us to see what's going across the network. And at this case, we can see like this one's getting 77,000 hits, pretty common rule. But this one is getting 0, or this one's never being used. And that's a way for us to kind of clean up our filters. Remember, the more rules we have, that it has to go through those, right? So for example, if I have 20 rules up here and only 3 are realistically being used, before it ever gets to this deny or allow, it has to go through all 20 of those rules. The more rules, the slower your traffic gets over time, right? Yes, this is fairly fast, but throw a couple hundred rules in there and your firewall is going to make your traffic slow down. It literally has to go and match all these lines of rules, which is why you always want the ones to match the most up at the very top. For example, that one where users are trying to get to the internet, allow everything on application Adobe, that's getting hit 77,000 times. We should always have that towards the top. They have a policy optimizer available on the left-hand side. So you would click on your policies, security, then you have this policy optimizer section over here on the left-hand side. That policy optimizer section allows us to check for rule usage within the last 30 days, 90 days, and just completely never been used. This is a great way for you to go back and clean up your policies. All right. I'm getting ready to do this kind of maintenance in the real world too, where I have stuff that's never been hit for the last 365 days. And we're like, okay, we should kill that rule. Well, it turns out we only use that service once every year in order to back up and archive stuff. So I can't kill the rule. I got to be a little smart about what I'm doing with the rule, but it's not a very common rule. So where do I put it? Clear down at the bottom before the allow all type stuff. All right. To make things easier, how many of you guys have memorized the IP address of everything on your home network? Okay, like one or two, right? Just us diehard nerds. I love you. All right. Most of us can't do that. We need some kind of name that's easier in the logs to figure out what's really going on. So we click on objects at the top, addresses, and then we can create address objects. This allows us to create something like Bureau 121. It's the address object for that particular thing. And we could choose an IP or IP net mask, which means we're going to give it the IP address and the net mask of it. We may give it an IP address range. So we would say anything in this range is this name. What the idea behind this, the more address objects that you create, the easier it is for you to create your rules, right? So if I want to have my server 1 and server 2 in my address policies or my security policies, I don't need to memorize their IP addresses. I could just use their names in the actual rules. The other benefit of that is I can always come in here and update the address objects later on. I do not have to go change my policy rules. So if server address goes from 212.034. Well, 0 is a horrible one, say 2, and it now changed to 200, I can go update my address object, and it changes everywhere in the system that it references that object. If I use IP addresses, I may have to change it in 30 different places. So the more objects that you set up, the easier life is managing without throughout the firewall. All right. Let's see here. I could also create a group of addresses, something like malicious IP group. And this allows me to keep adding addresses to this group. And therefore, I can use the group in a policy in order to clear things up. So an example of this is I have a Python script that scrapes the logs for anybody trying to brute force into the firewall, particularly for the VPN side of the house. If they're trying to brute force into Global Protect, I end up adding their address to a whitelist, or in this case, a blacklist text file. Then using the REST API, I inject them into this address group. I don't have to manually add them one by one into the thing. I can just say, make them a part of this group. And anywhere that group is listed in my security policies, it immediately starts taking effect. So if I run that every hour at the top of the hour, it will dynamically start blacklisting IP addresses that are known trying to have issues log into my Global Protect. In this case, it's something like if they fail 5 times within 5 minutes, you can turn on like a ban limiter. Some of you guys have seen that, kill ban, or there's some other ban limiters out there. The problem is they can always end up accessing after that timeout, right? This goes, okay, no, I'm done with you. Once you've failed 5 times in that time, you're permanently banned and in my blacklist side. Obviously, you don't want to lock yourself out in this kind of stuff. So. Creating a dynamic address group. This allows us to set tagged IP addresses automatically to a group. No comment necessary. IP addresses in a group are used to match those rules. And so this is actually what I'm doing is more of a dynamic address group where I go in, I add an IP address and I tag it. In this case, mine's blacklist, but in this description, we're tagging it as quarantine. It would go ahead and match those and then deny that traffic going through. Same way with tags. We talked about tags earlier when we talked about rules. This is a way for you to do filtering on the firewall. So the more tags you set up that makes more sense, you can pick colors, etc. It's a way for you to filter out logs, IPs, security policies, everything else based on tags. You can set those up on the security policy, which is what we just talked about down there. So we can group everything together, for example, mail servers. Makes it a whole lot easier than searching through 100 rules. I just type in tag filter of mail servers. I get only the rules that are associated with that mail server. The more of this you do when you first set it up, you will love your life when you're trying to work on this at 3 in the morning and everything's down and you can't figure out why. Sounds like it doesn't happen. This gray came by honestly. Okay. All right, tag-based rule setup. Again, you can filter those over in the policies over on the right, and you can change those and group those accordingly. Testing, that's always a handy thing you can do. So if you go to policies and security, you can actually do a security test patch, in which case, before we actually commit this one, we can run a test. For example, I want to see if traffic that is coming from the user's net to the internet from this source IP address to this destination address on this port number, we can get as finite as we want all the way down, run it, and then we can get the results over here whether or not it's going to match. All right. So yes, we could go in and run a test, but it's much easier to just test it at the firewall and make sure that it's actually going to hit that policy. Right. So what we do is test it here, make sure it works. If it works, put it into play, test it again in real life, make sure it's actually blocking the traffic. The global find, which is a magnifying glass in the upper right-hand corner, allows you to do a search. So if I do a search there and then I filter out by SMTP, I can find everything on this system, in this case associated with applications, that's filtered out to SMTP, that has something to do with SMTP. All right. When you get into your traffic logs, you can always click on the little icon on the left-hand side. That'll give you a really detailed view of that traffic entry. This is, again, a great way to troubleshoot. You come into your traffic log, click on this one. We're going to get all the details as to which one it actually applied, which policy, where that user is coming from, the country, etc. You're going to get tons of information. You will also get these little entries down here at the bottom, which is great. Sometimes you will get a PCAP over here. Does anybody know what a PCAP is? Packet capture. And what can we use those in?
Wireshark.
Wireshark, right? So you guys did that a little bit in Internet Networking 1 and 2 where you used Wireshark. This allows you to download that PCAP, load it up in Wireshark on your PC, and kind of see what kind of traffic went through there, all right? If you're having issues, you could always tell it to go in and start capturing and do these PCAPs. It will do one from time to time by default. It won't log everything, right? Otherwise, we'll fill up the hard drive. But you could specifically tell it to start doing it for this policy so that maybe we can dive in a little deeper and see what's going on. Okay. That's pretty much the summary. Again, the whole meat and potatoes behind a firewall in here is these security policies. Right? The better you write them, the better off you are. You get too particular, you're going to start blocking a lot of traffic. So sometimes you leave it a little more open to begin with, go through, figure out what applications are going through your system. Then we're going to go ahead and start enabling just those applications. Right? This will make or break you when you're dealing with this firewall. It will be the bane of your existence or the best thing that ever happened to you. And both at once. All right? This is usually what kills people in firewalls, and they give up because they get so sick and tired of security policies and they can't figure out why it's not working. And it's usually because they have something flip-flopped or they got way too prescriptive and they're blocking too much traffic. All right? Sometimes you just have to throw in a rule above it, allow everything, start seeing what's actually working, then go back and figure out what you did in your rule. And it's usually a stupid checkbox somewhere. I'll be honest with you. It's literally a checkbox or a drop-down or something you missed and you never notice it. That's usually what causes that policy issue. But until then, you're going to spend hours troubleshooting why your policy is not working. All right. So what I'm getting at is become familiar with those troubleshooting tools. The more you guys can start to use those, the quicker that diagnosing window gets down, the quicker you're back up and running. All right. It may be a 3 a.m. call, but you may be back in bed by 3:05 if you know how to troubleshoot it. And if you figure that out, how to do that from 3 o'clock to 3:05, I want to know. Because usually it takes me at least till 5 in the morning.
I was gonna say it usually takes me till 3:10 to get the voicemail and wake up.
You got it. You got it. We may have spent a few hours on call back in the day, right, RJ?
Yeah, I just got one last night.
Nice, nice. All right. So on Thursday, we're going to go through the lab and actually set up these policies. By now, short of NAT, we should be able to start getting out towards the internet. So I do have to double check these pods. So if you guys try to do the lab before Thursday, just know it may or may not work. I'm still tearing those down and rebuilding them up to make sure they have internet access like they're supposed to. But we can't forget our fun little questions, right? Everybody wants to know those.
If we're using like OpenSense or something,
Uh-huh.
like the rule configuration is pretty much the same.
You got it. It's going to be very similar. You're going to see more features in a Palo Alto, but the concept of a security policy is the exact same. You just have to fill it in accordingly. It's a little more obfuscated on an OpenSense, but the process is exactly the same. Yep. And we'll actually pull up a pfSense OpenSense interface once we get through some of this material and start comparing between the two to kind of see what the difference is, because you guys should be exposed to both in order to get through there. So which two items are required to match criteria in a Palo Alto security policy rule? We have source zone, destination address, and destination port. A and B. The zones are the ones that are required. Beyond that, those are just additional information that will help us nail it down quicker, right? Remember, we're a zone-based firewall. So a lot of people are trying to get the zone-based. For example, Ubiquity just moved their entire platform over to zone-based. So if you have zone-based and then you set up these same type of security policies, you're going to start seeing an uptick in some of the Ubiquity stuff. That was one of the big complaints in all their firewalls, is that they didn't really have this style of interface. Now that they've moved zone-based and everything else, they're on par with something like Palo Alto or some of these other ones that are out there. The same way on the application side of it. Like, I love it. I can go home and just specifically turn off Minecraft and watch my kids yell and murder, but they can figure out why their TV's still working and everything else, right? Before I just killed the internet, they complained. Well, then I couldn't watch TV. That's not cool. So now I can just go straight to their device, click, 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 ban a few services, and wait for them to come upstairs. They take out the trash. I take it off, right? Don't mess with the guy that runs the network. All right. Which type of security policy rule is the default rule type? Intrazone, interzone, universal, or default? C, right? Why would default be a default? Yeah, that's a tricky one. Don't get tripped on that one. Yes, universal is your default rule type. Which action in a security policy rule results in traffic being silently rejected? Deny, drop, reset server, reset client. Drop, right? At drop, we literally drop the packet. They have no clue what happened. They get no kind of feedback, no message, nothing else in between. If we get a reset server, reset client, what kind of packet would you get in TCP that would do that?
Server reset.
Yeah, you get like a server reset packet or a server client reset packet. Normally, you guys are getting ACKs and SYNACKs and things like that, making sure that that TCP window is going up. In this case, it just sends reset packets constantly when you send them in. Okay, true or false, logging on a intrazone default and interzone default security policy rules is enabled by default. That's correct. What is the process in order for us to enable logging on those interfaces or those policies? Not necessarily, but what's the actual process for enabling logging on those two specifically? Yes. So you have to click on their security policy in the lineup. That's the only time you'll see override pop up at the bottom. You click on override, go into which tab in order to change logging. That's right. I'll quiz you harder than the quiz. Not really though. You have tabs across the top. Whoops. Actions. Yep. So if I can get back here where it actually shows me one. Come on. There. So you have your general source, destination, application, service category, actions, and usage. And under actions is where we actually specify what we're going to do with that packet. And in this case, that could be down at the bottom here where we have log at session end. And in this case, you guys would want to click one of those in order to turn that on.
Is there like a reason for the session end versus session start?
Yeah, so session end, you're only going to do by default because that's when the session's terminated. It'll log the traffic. If you're trying to troubleshoot, you want to see it at the start of the session. In other words, you may get a flood of those start sessions, but you may not necessarily need to see it till the session actually ends. So it comes back to logging and how much storage space you're going to get on the logging side of the thing. And filling of the traffic logs, right? Because then you get double entries. You get one for the start, one for the end, one for the start, one for the end. After we click log at whatever we decide, what do we do next? That's exactly right. And it sounds silly, but you're going to sit there and go test right away because you just clicked it and nothing's happening. You forgot to commit. So it sounds silly, but you will stand there blank face and try to figure out why this isn't working. And you'll notice the commit up at the top is what color? White or gray? White. It shows up white when there's changes to be ready to commit it. If it's gray, there's no changes that have been made. I say all this stuff because this is where I've been stuck many, many times, even though I use it daily. All right. I'm not being mean. I'm just saving you from hours of agony trying to figure out why something's not working. All right. I'm fairly certain you guys got those all correct, but let's double check. A, B, C, D, B. Perfect. All right. We will see everybody on Thursday and go over those labs. And again, if you do it ahead of time, I can't guarantee the internet portion works, but I will on Thursday. Thanks, RJ.